Okay, so now that we've introduced the kind of new key concept of primitive accumulation, and again, luckily you actually already know what it is, you just didn't know what the word was that the process actually refers to, but you know and understand primitive accumulation, or as David Harvey calls it, accumulation by dispossession. So now what we're going to do is we're going to look at a case study. And the case study, of course, most of you hopefully are familiar with it because it was based on your readings for this week by Marcus Rediker. Now, at the end of this little case study, I'm actually going to post a clip of Marcus Rediker himself, the author of this week's reading, where Professor Halperin interviews him to talk about a lot of what he's arguing in that particular piece. And I'll set that up toward the end. Okay, so if we think about what we're looking at here, right? Rediker calls what happens in the American colonies a kind of detour. And part of the reason he calls it a detour is because this process of primitive accumulation, which is the dispossessing of people from their land, right, was supposed to have already happened in England, right? Now, of course, we know, based on the first video, that it's still happening now, but the point is, and this is the argument that Rediker makes in that piece, is that it's always kind of happening in different places across space and time, right? It may have happened originally in England starting in the 16th century, and what you had was the move from these kind of peasants being dispossessed of their land into wage labor. And then once they go to America, once the descendants of those people who were initially dispossessed in the 16th century, once their descendants, their children and grandchildren or great-grandchildren, end up in the American colonies, the process repeats itself. And he explains in that article quite well how it works, but I'm just going to try to summarize very quickly what happens. So, now what is different? And I'm going to give you a little bit of a background here. Obviously, the American colonies are a very different landscape than England, right? This was, from their point of view, new land. Of course, it's not new land. They're taking it from somebody, often violently, but this is the way that they thought of it. So what is different in the New World is that it had no feudal past. There was no feudalism to be overthrown. You didn't have great feudal landlords in Virginia or Massachusetts or South Carolina, right? This was a period when laborers in England, right, were already loosened from the land, right? So in the words of the great English historian of capitalism, E.P. Thompson, which is actually quoted in the article, Thompson said, workers at this point had escaped from the social controls of the manorial village, which is feudalism, right, these feudal rights, and were not yet subject to the discipline of the factory. So we're looking at a period that Rediker talks about, which has had less attention in the history of capitalism. A lot of the focus ends up, post-1750 or post-1800, when we get that transition to industrial capitalism. But as you guys know by now, the emergence of capitalism happens before technology is introduced, right? You get that division of labor, you get this capitalist mode of production that leads to the Industrial Revolution, right? The Industrial Revolution is a result of the turn to capitalism, right? Not the cause of capitalism. So what Thompson is getting at in that quote is by the time people are moving to the Americas in the late 17th and early to mid 18th century, that process where a lot of the English, what were descendants of the peasantry, by that point were working as wage laborers, whether for landlords on the countryside or by the 17th and 18th century, more often than not, they were working in cities like London, Birmingham, Liverpool, Manchester, right? This is the beginning of free wage labor in England, right? So they are pre-industrial wage workers, right? They're not working in the factory system yet, as Thompson said, but they are working for wages in sort of smaller shops and manufacturing enterprises. Now, ironically, again, like I said, it was the free wage English workers whose grandparents in the 16th century had been dispossessed of their land as the process of primitive accumulation and enclosure played out, who would then find themselves back into this kind of unfree labor once they made passage to the Americas. Now, most of this, as I said, material comes from this week's reading, the Marcus Rediker piece. Now, what Rediker calls the reattachment of workers to the means of production. That is, most workers that went to the colony were free wage workers in England, but then became unfree laborers tied to a piece of land or the means of production in the United States, or what would become the United States, the American colonies. What Rediker shows is essentially the backsliding. And this partly speaks to the unevenness with which capitalism develops, right? It's not linear, right? Primitive accumulation may have petered out in England, but it's starting again in America, or it starts again in other English colonies. Rhetorica refers to the early modern period in England, right? Which is the late 1400s to the late 1700s, or really like 1500 to 1800. That was when the process of primitive accumulation or accumulation by dispossession was nearly complete, or at least well underway. Now, what he means by this backsliding is that a process that was supposed to be complete in the past stages of capitalist development in England began anew in the American colonies. So first let's look at the different forms of labor, especially the unfree kind. So if we look at different forms of labor that were highlighted in the piece, right? Rhetorica talks about hunters, right, that are not wage laborers. They're not necessarily unfree. They're probably the most free. They live in sort of the countryside and they make their money by hunting. There's craft labor, which was that petty production, right, which was, in some cases, it was a master craftsman that was taking place in Massachusetts. There's domestic labor, which is people that worked as kind of domestic servants in households, right, butlers, maids, that kind of thing. There's free wage labor, which is obvious, right? It's somebody who works for a wage. There's also unwaged independent farming. A lot of this is farmers who, it's kind of like the yeoman upcountry farmers that we looked at in the American Revolution. These are farmers who own their own land but kind of exist outside the market, which is why they're unwaged, right? So they produce a kind of subsistence lifestyle. Maybe they sell some of their crop, but not really. And then there's indentured servitude. Now, this is what I'm going to focus on a little bit more here. Indentured servitude, I talked a little bit about earlier, but essentially indentured servitude works this way. You are a free wage laborer in England, right? Maybe you're not that happy with the conditions. Maybe you're seeking adventure. Maybe, things aren't going well in your life and you just want to get out of there for whatever reason, right? Now, ideally, what you do then is you think, maybe there's a lot of opportunity for me in the colonies, in the Americas, in the New World, right? So what that person does is they basically sign a contract. And this allows them passage to the Americas, and they're signing a contract to work for somebody. And what indentured servitude is, you sign a contract and are basically selling yourself, your labor, as property. It's not the same thing as slavery, but it is a form of unfree labor for a fixed period of time. It's temporary. This is one of the key differences between indentured servitude and slavery. Slavery is not temporary. Somebody is enslaved, they will probably die a slave, and their children will probably die a slave, right? An indentured servant is somebody who signs a contract for a period of years, usually between 7 and 10, maybe 12 years, where you basically are the de facto property of an employer. And after that 7 to 10 years, you are then let go. You become free, okay? And this is where there are certain similarities to slavery. Now, as we looked at and talked a little bit about in the American Revolution, initially, this was how most of the labor was supplied in the American colonies. Before they moved to plantation slavery, most of the labor that was brought in the mid to late 17th and early 18th century were white indentured servants. So people who were probably wage workers in cities in not just England, but also France and Germany signed contracts of indenture to go to the Americas and basically essentially become somebody's property or servant for a fixed period of time. This is what they use. Now, why they end up using this form of unfree labor, as the reading basically explains, is that the structure of society was very different in the American colonies than it was in England, right? In England, there basically was no more land available, right? You could buy land, but there was very little land to settle because somebody owned all the land. Well, in North America, at least, from the English perspective, there was a lot of available land. And again, with the caveat that, of course, it wasn't free land. Most of that land was violently dispossessed from indigenous peoples who had been living there for thousands of years. But from their point of view, there was a lot more land that was available than in England. It was also a much larger geographic space, which meant capital was less concentrated in the Americas. So this led to kind of a labor problem. How do you get labor? Well, initially, they tried to enslave indigenous people, which turns out to be a disaster. They find that it's virtually impossible. Not only can they not enslave them, but it's very difficult to force them to work and discipline their labor in the way that employers discipline labor. So they can't use indigenous people as slaves, like, say, the Spanish did in Mexico and Peru initially. So they turn to white European indentured servants because there is a labor shortage. And part of the reason unfree labor is so necessary is because of the wide geographic expansion of the Americas, or of the English colonies. The fact that there was a lot of land available, the fact that you could disappear quite easily So they had to come over as bonded laborers in this point to allow them more control over their labor. So part of what Rediker is getting at with this idea of primitive accumulation still happening in the Americas and why he calls it a backslide is, think about it this way. Okay, you're a wage laborer that is working in London. You sign a contract of indenture. You come to the Americas. You're working as an indentured servant, which means you're kind of reattached to the means of production. You don't own the means of production, but the relationship you have with your employer is similar, not exactly the same, similar to the way a peasant would have had their social relationships of production with the landlord, right? They are not free to leave in the way that a lot of peasants were not free to leave the land. So they're reattached to the means of production, even if they're not exactly living a free life, right? So the process of people becoming dispossessed or disattached from the means of production plays itself out again. So either the indentured servant finishes their contract and is freed, and now they're a free wage laborer again, or they run away. And this was the key means of resistance that was available to most laborers, whether they are indentured servants or slaves that made it to the New World, right? In the case of indentured servants, or the case of even wage workers that did exist, it was harder to form unions or trade organizations because of the wide geographic area. Not only was capital less concentrated in the Americas, or at least the English colonies, but labor was less concentrated, right? It's a huge geographic area, much larger than England. So the principal means of resistance was for them to actually run away, right? Once they ran away, they were now dispossessed of their access to the means of production, right? Means of production that even though they had access to, they were not free. But again, think of this comparison with the peasants, right? The peasants, before they were dispossessed of their land, may have had access to the means of production, but they were not free, right? They were not free to go. They were not free to leave and do as they pleased. They couldn't go look for a better deal with another landlord, right? This is why Adam Smith saw it as liberating, right? So that process of primitive accumulation has now played itself out again in the Americas. It's that backsliding that Rediker is talking about. Slavery is another example. A slave can run away. Slaves, even though they are not free, have access to the means of subsistence because they are attached to the means of production. They have no freedom, right? Certainly even less freedom than peasants would have had. But once they run away, they are now basically, I think the word that Rediker uses is they're basically stripped from the means of production, right? This idea of producers, people that are the original producers who are producing something, are taken away from the means of production, right? And sometimes they do it themselves by running away. And once they do that, they are now entering this realm of, in the case of white European indentured servants, free wage labor. For some runaway slaves, they could find work as free wage laborers in the north, but often it was very easy for them to be recaptured and put back into slavery, which is partly why you get the rise of racial slavery in the English colonies. If an white indentured servant runs away and ends up in New York, well, you're probably never going to find them again. But if you make slavery race-based, well, then it's very easy to find them again, right? Basically what they do is just stop anybody who's of African descent and ask for their pass. Who are you? You have to prove that you are legally free. And this was a problem in the Americas. And it's one reason why, even though slaves who were free were technically free, they were never really free, because it was very easy for them, if they ended up in the wrong place at the wrong time, could be re-enslaved. Those of you that saw the movie 12 Years a Slave, that's an example where a free man happened to be in the wrong place at the wrong time and then spent 12 years as a slave as a result. So this is what we're talking about in the context of the Americas, and I might leave it there at this point. And what we'll do now is, I think I'll introduce the video. So what you'll look at now after this is an actual video from Marcus Rediker himself explaining how this process worked and what the importance of unfree labor, the persistence of unfree labor in the American colonies meant in the context of capitalism. Now, there's a little bit at the end of the video that is a little bit confusing that you can just ignore. When this course was taught previously and you had access to the library, the way we did the book review assignment, was you could pick any book. But because the libraries were not open for the first half of the semester, and are still, I think, technically not open or are about to open, we decided to have 4 books for you to pick for the book review assignment. So when he starts talking about his books at the end that you might review, I mean, you can listen to it because the books that he wrote are very interesting, but just ignore the part about choosing them for a book review assignment. All right, I'll leave it at that.